Hey guys, what's up? This is River. This is the Canon 80D. This is Canon's best photo, video, vlogging, cinematic filmmaking, travel video camera, whatever you want to do with the camera. This thing absolutely rocks. You should go buy the camera. Review over. Just kidding, but seriously, this camera is amazing. I'm completely in love with it. Let's do an in-depth review and let me geek out and gush about this camera to you and just tell you how amazing of a camera this is. This camera is being used by all your favorite YouTubers, Casey Neistat, Peter McKinnon, Sarah Dietschy, Roman Atwood, PewDiePie. This camera is just everyone's favorite and it's my favorite. So we're gonna start this review a little bit differently. Normally I talk about the price or like what this camera does, the specs, all that. But today we're gonna talk about design. Canon knew exactly what you were gonna do with it and they designed it exactly for your needs. This camera is built from ground up to be a powerhouse for photo and video. And now this might seem like a small thing, but my favorite thing on this camera is actually where the headphone jack is placed. Usually most cameras with articulating screens tend to hit the headphone jack. But on this camera, it's specifically set up so that when you're turning your screen around, it does not hit the headphone jack. And that's just one of the many things that this camera does right, because this camera is built ground up for filmmakers. The next thing that I really like about this camera is when you glance down at the camera, there's an LCD screen that shows you your settings. Shows you your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, what focus mode you're in. Basically everything that's critical to getting the right shot. We've all been there. You get an awesome shot and then you look down and you're like, wait, I had the wrong shutter speed on. I had the wrong aperture on. Wait, hold on, I messed this up. And that really sucks. The fact that it's right there, it just makes it that much harder to mess up your shot, and it's just that much better for filmmakers. When Canon designed this camera, they were very intentional with the design. This is really made for filmmakers and YouTubers. It's really made to make our lives and our jobs that much easier. The next thing that I really like about this camera is above that LCD screen is a button for ISO, autofocus, and drive. This is good for photos and this is good for video. Just having your settings right there, quickly accessible, lets you just work that much faster with this camera. And to be honest, I could go on and on about how well the buttons on this camera are laid out. It's just a dream for a filmmaker and a photo shooter. There's a button right there for magnifying your image. There's touch autofocus. There's a scroll wheel and an up and down and left right button. Just anything you need. Every key setting that you want to change on the fly is right there, and it just makes your workflow that much faster. And now, the million-dollar question. Can you start a YouTube channel? Can you vlog with this camera? Can you make mind-blowing YouTube videos with cinematic looks and amazing color grade with this camera? Dear viewer, yes. Yes, you can. I like to call the Canon 80D the camera that launched 1,000 YouTube channels. As I mentioned in my intro, this camera is being used by Casey Neistat, Peter McKinnon, Sarah Dietschy, Roman Atwood, PewDiePie. Everybody loves this camera. It is just amazing for vlogging. One of the things that I love about this camera is the 3-inch super bright articulating screen. Pointing this camera at yourself with the autofocus is super easy. It's nice and light. As you can see, I'm not using a stabilizer or any kind of like tripod with this, and I'm getting great footage. The face tracking autofocus and the touch autofocus are two things that make this camera a must-have. If you're someone that's not that experienced with cameras and you're like, oh, how do I focus a lens? How do I do this technical stuff? Just touch the screen and focus your camera. Or if you have a face, the camera will just focus to your face. Now, it's one thing to say that a camera is really good for vlogging, but it's another thing to show you how good it is for vlogging. So I'm about to go see my trainer and I'm gonna take this camera and you guys with me. Yeah, as you can tell, this camera's pretty easy to use and it doesn't feel like it's much more work than my phone. And you can see today it's pouring here in Toronto. It's been like this all month. But because this camera's water resistance, as a vlogger, it makes it that much better because you're not worried about the weather, not worried about your precious camera breaking. And with that that being said, you can tell this camera is pretty easy to use. It's pretty fun to use, and that's what you want in a vlogging camera. You want something that's fun to use, something that's easy to use, something that pushes you to be creative, and something that makes it fun to go out and vlog every day, because vlogging every day is kind of a grind, but if you have something that makes it fun and easy, you'll do it more and you'll be more successful. So yeah, to recap, fantastic vlogging camera. The way it's designed and set up is exactly made for vlogging. So now that we have all that out of the way, let's talk about the image quality of this camera. The specs in this camera are not the fanciest, but what makes this camera special is the Canon look. The Canon look can best be described as smooth, warm, beautiful skin tones, a really warm yellow and orange glow, and like almost like a warm hue to all of the images. Basically, this camera looks good right out of the box with very, very little editing. And if you're a vlogger, the camera image is ready to go right out of the box with zero editing, which is why I think this is such a good camera for vlogging. So let's get into the nitty gritty of this camera. This camera has a 24.2 megapixel sensor. For photos, it shoots 7 frames per second and it has 14-bit RAW. If you are someone that wants to do professional work, hobby work, or any kind of photo work, this camera is great. And especially if you're doing sports photography, 7 frames per second is more than good enough to get high-speed action. And as for video, you get 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second at full HD. Now, I don't expect anybody to shoot feature films with it, but you could easily do mid-tier documentary work and high-end online video work. The one thing that I do wish Canon provided with this camera is some kind of cinematic or log profile. Don't get me wrong. This camera looks beautiful. It is a 9 out of 10 in my opinion. However, if you want to shoot like cinematic, really pretty, like movie-like stuff, this camera can deliver, but it would just be that much easier for color grading and post-production if it had some kind of log profile. By the way, quick side note, this camera does have the ability to install third-party picture profiles. Now, they're not the easiest thing to do, and they're not officially supported by Canon, but if you guys are feeling a little bit ambitious and you just want to push your camera just that tiny, weeny bit further, do a quick Google search. There's a lot of information about this on the internet. Now, I've talked about how good the photo in this camera is, and I've talked about how good the video in this camera is, but one thing that pertains to both of those features is the autofocus in this camera. It is absolutely amazing. The dual pixel autofocus in this camera has a really good reputation. It's something that's become very popular in a lot of Canon cameras, and it's super duper seamless. It's never given me any problems. It just always works, even in low light. I actually don't think I've ever used a Canon camera that didn't have good autofocus in photo mode, but nonetheless, it's there, it's super good, and I highly recommend it if you're looking to do primarily photos with this camera. The low light in this camera is nothing special. When it comes to shooting low light video, the A7S line is still top dog. However, due to the higher end image processor, which this camera has a Digic 8, this camera is very clean at 6400 ISO, which is really awesome for a Canon camera. It's still not as good as an A7S, but this is really good for a Canon, and if you do ever need to do low light work in a pinch, this camera will do you just fine. Next, let's talk about build quality. Earlier in this video, I discussed how this camera is really built for filmmakers and vloggers, and it's intentionally designed in a way that suits their needs. One thing that's really important for a camera like that is build quality and durability, and this camera holds up. Unfortunately, it's been rainy here in Toronto non-stop for the last month and a half, but thankfully, because this camera is weather sealed, I'm not too afraid of taking it outside and exposing it to the elements. Other than that, the buttons feel really solidly built, the hinge for the articulating screen feels really solid, and overall, it just has a nice, robust feel where I genuinely feel like this camera will last you a really long time. You can put it through its paces, you can scuff it up, you can bump it around, and it will not break down on you. Speaking of design, I actually find the touchscreen on this camera the best way to operate the camera. The menu is really well laid out, it's super snappy, super responsive, and it's a more intuitive way to change settings on this camera than the buttons are now. So pros and cons of this camera. To be honest, I really love this camera. There's really nothing on this camera that I have a complaint about. If there was something that I absolutely had to complain about, I think it would be the lack of 4K and the lack of cinema profiles. 4K in this camera would be really nice, but to be honest, it's not really a deal breaker. But I do feel like this camera would just be like 10% better if it had cinema profiles pre-installed. So who's this camera really for? This camera is really geared towards YouTube content creators. If you're someone that just wants to get out there, make cool stuff, capture cool moments, and just have your stuff look good right out of the box, it's being used by a lot of the top YouTubers right now, like Casey Neistat, Sarah Dietschy, Peter McKinnon. And if you're someone that wants to emulate that kind of a YouTube channel, I highly recommend you check out this camera. If you're someone that wants to make strictly cinematic content, like you want to make short films, you want to make commercials, as good as this camera is and as well built and well designed as this camera is, I would maybe look into something like the GH5 or the A7 series because of the price point. Pretty close price-wise, but it gives you all the extra cinematic looks and the cinematic options that someone that's strictly a filmmaker would want in a camera like this. But if you're mainly a YouTuber and strictly a content creator, I really wouldn't bother with those cameras. Hey guys, thanks for checking out the review. This camera has been an absolute pleasure to review. There's a link in the description below. I really recommend you check out the camera if you're a YouTube content creator. Also, if you have any questions about this camera whatsoever, leave me a question in the comments down below. I'll be sure to respond to every single one of you. And once again, be sure to like and subscribe for future content. Until next time.